Now welcome to another lightning response video, where this time the question comes to us from Joshua Menninger, who asked, "Hey Thor, would like your feedback on this one, especially my comment about the 80s below to see what your take on this is. Yes, the narrative has always been wrong. The three main characters of the original Star Wars had a female lead for goodness sake. Everyone loved Carrie Fisher. Do these people simply not know their history? Honestly, as someone who lived through the 80s, I get tired of people pointing to that time and saying things like, well, it was a different time and there was a lot of racism back then, etc., etc. The truth is, if you actually look at the movies of that time, we had many female leads, many multiracial leads, many characters who were gay or bisexual or whatever, and pretty much no one ever talked about it. Just start going through the list of the movies and watch the ones you want. You start to see that they were always there. It was not a big deal. And people either liked the movies or didn't like the movies based on their story, and really nothing else. I think they're just trying to create drama where there is none. And it's kind of funny, but when I look back and really think about it, virtually everything I grew up with watching as a kid, like the cartoons of the time, and mainly we're talking the mid-80s here, which was my peak cartoon watching era, and though I may be a bit biased, it's also when some of the best cartoons of all time were going on. Anyway, they all had what today we'd call diversity in them. Almost all of them had strong female characters, as well as characters of all different colors or races. And nobody really talked about it or cared. I don't remember it ever really being a big deal one way or another, or should I say there being a big deal made out of it. Nor do I remember boys ever hating the female characters in those cartoons or shows just because they were girls or whatever. And yeah, I'm sure some did. Of course, some did. I think most kids just accepted them as part of the team and enjoyed the cartoon without giving it much thought, because it wasn't like anyone was making this huge fuss about how important they were and that I must accept them or I'm a terrible person. They were just there and you could like them or not like them, and that was it. Along with this, and I know I've told this story before, but when I was 8 years old, my dad, without my mom's knowledge, he took me to see the movie Aliens, and I very much remember being pretty scared. But I clearly remember, or can still envision, sitting in the theater and thinking how kind of brave and awesome Ripley was. Didn't matter that she was a man or a woman or whatever, I just enjoyed and loved the character. The same way I know plenty of girls or young women once watched Luke Skywalker and saw him save the galaxy and have loved that character ever since. And just overall, I feel like my generation was taught, and mind you, this is just my personal experience. I obviously don't speak for everyone, for an entire generation, and I sure as hell am not saying the 80s were some sort of perfect, harmonious age where there was no racism or sexism or anything. But with my generation, at least how and where I grew up, we were basically taught not to notice skin color or gender or anything else. We were taught to treat everyone the same, or how we'd want to be treated. I feel like that is the motto of my entire generation. And it wasn't something we were even directly taught necessarily. It wasn't like we were constantly sat down and had it drilled into our head over and over not to judge other people. Instead, it was more like, well, duh, you don't treat people differently just because they look different or act different or have different beliefs or whatever else it might be. Again, it was more like, well, do you want people treating you a certain way for your differences? No? Well then, don't do it to other people. It's that simple. And I really do feel like the movies and shows and cartoons of the time reflected that attitude. They didn't need to, again, kind of drill it into your head or make a point about treating people well. You were just meant to accept them because they existed. I'm not supposed to watch a cartoon like G.I. Joe, for example, and think, well, those are the strong female Joes, those are the black ones, that's the Asian Joe, and that's the Native American one, and so on. They were all just G.I. Joes. They were all part of the same team. None were supposed to be either better or lesser for any of those reasons. And I really do feel like this attitude kind of persisted or continued into the 90s and much of the 2000s so far. And that in entertainment, there was still, again, what you'd call diversity in most things I watched or what were popular in general, both cartoons and regular entertainment for adults. That it never really changed, but what changed was the attitude around it or the importance placed upon it. Starting not quite 10 years ago, I'd say. That's when suddenly now, instead of not noticing race and gender or whatever else it might be, we were told to notice these things or else we were part of the problem. Suddenly, I feel like entertainment put this whole new level of importance upon itself. It started saying, these are huge problems in the modern world, and claimed they were going to fix them for us by showing diversity, even though they'd been doing that for as long as I'd been alive and watching TV and movies, basically. and had been showing it in a way where, again, it was meant to be something you naturally accepted instead of had to actively notice. Almost out of nowhere, and starting, I think, with Rey from Star Wars, it almost feels like, I don't know, like she was the harbinger of this change in Hollywood or entertainment in general. It was like, again, out of nowhere, they suddenly put a lot of self-importance on what they were doing. They weren't just making movies and shows anymore. They were going to solve the problems of the world they insisted were huge problems. Which isn't to say they weren't problems at all and that more couldn't be done, but the way they went about it made it seem like they were the saviors instead of just people making movies and shows. And this felt like a pretty huge change because, again, for as long as I can remember, they used to just more or less focus on trying to simply entertain people. And I say more or less because, yes, of course, there's always been films and shows that tackled truly important issues and tried to do or say something very important. And again, I'm not saying that back then in the 80s or 90s or today that things are perfect or that they at least couldn't be a whole hell of a lot better for more people. The world's never been perfect and never will be, sadly. But that, of course, doesn't mean we can't try to make it better or the best it possibly can be. But suddenly something like Star Wars, which had always already been for anybody and everybody who wanted to watch and enjoy it, but suddenly it felt like it was fighting a war of its own creation, in a sense. It was going to solve the no strong female character problem, even though, almost ironically, the franchise is often credited as kind of creating the first or best strong female character of all time, that being Princess Leia. It had also given us plenty of other ones along the way as well, ones that no one had ever really rejected or complained about just because they were female characters. Yes, as I talked about in a video the other day, there were those who rejected like Ahsoka Tano at first, but that was done because, for one, they found her very annoying, and for two, they didn't see how Anakin could have a Padawan during the Clone Wars. That was a big part of the negative reception to the character. So basically, it had nothing to do with her gender, just like many fans not being such a huge fan of Hayden Christensen's portrayal of Anakin in the prequels had nothing to do with his gender. It'd be laughable to suggest, wouldn't it? There were other reasons why some did not like him, with perhaps the biggest one being the dialogue he was given to work with, which was not his fault at all. And so, despite some wanting to basically ignore history because if they do, they can make themselves out to be the heroes or saviors of the time, those who are changing the world for the better, they literally want to pat themselves on the back for solving the problems they insist are there. But the problem is there had been plenty of female characters in Star Wars before, and none of them had been flat out rejected for being female. And yet here Disney and Lucasfilm were with Rey, acting as if she was this great gift being bestowed upon the fandom. That it had finally made a character that not only female Star Wars fans could adore, but that girls or women of all ages could get behind and enjoy, especially in the realm of sci-fi and fantasy on the whole, where that had never happened before. We had literally never seen a woman be the lead in anything remotely like this before, because there totally wasn't like a 4-film franchise called Hunger Games that had just come out. But anyway, to wrap this up, my point is that no, the world has never been perfect and completely fair, and we can always do more or try to do more to make it better for more people. And I certainly don't think this push for more diversity is an inherently bad one, as much as I think it's one that ignores recent history and has kind of been hijacked by people who want to place a whole lot of self-importance upon themselves and what they're doing. So much so that they're claiming or make it sound like things were a lot worse back in the day than they actually were. Which again isn't to say they were perfect or great. I'm not saying everybody looks back at the 80s as being this fond time period, but it certainly wasn't as some want to portray it in order to prop themselves up today. And doing so is a pretty sad and despicable thing, because we should always focus on the progress we've made instead of insisting there isn't progress until I have come along and solved all the problems, which is what I feel like modern Hollywood is kind of trying to do today. Well, that's all I got for you this time. Now it's your turn to take to the comments below and tell me what you think about this. Was Rey, intentionally or not, the one who kind of ushered in this new era or this new age of movies and shows that we're living in, where diversity seems to be essentially the most important thing, even though we've kind of had diversity in films and shows for a while now? Or, of course, you can always ask a question for a future lightning response video. Whatever you choose to do, though, leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.